Hello and welcome to IHW Council's special web show, Setting Tone of Life, where we will discuss all about lipid disorders and the effect of high cholesterol. IHW Council is dedicated towards increasing awareness about one's health and well-being. And today we're asking, is stress leading to high cholesterol? This show is powered by Lupin. Now, we have been speaking to senior cardiologists in the country on our web shows who have pointed out that Indians are known to have amongst the highest coronary artery disease rates in the world, and nearly 70% of the population has at least one lipid abnormality, which affects cholesterol in the blood, which over time clogs the arteries and puts pressure on the heart. Now, stress has also been blamed to cause heart attack, and now people are talking about a possible link between stress and cholesterol. So, will controlling stress reduce cholesterol problem that we are facing? And to talk about this, we are joined by our special guest. Please welcome Dr. Nimesh Desai, Senior Psychiatrist and former Director, Institute of Human Behavior and Allied Sciences, Delhi. Thank you so much, Dr. Desai, for joining us on this show. Now, the cardiologist told us that we produce cholesterol naturally in our body. Our body needs it. But now what's happening is we have too much of it. Plus, people talk a lot about stress, how bad it is, but some amount of stress actually isn't too bad. It helps our body function to its optimum. So what's happening here? Cholesterol is made naturally in our body. A little bit of stress is good for us, but something is going wrong where Indians are being predisposed to a lot of heart disease.
Yes. What's crucial, Anisha, in what you raised so well is that cumulative and heightened stress response is what leads to cholesterol issues and thereby leading to heart issues. And I'll repeat myself. Cumulative and high bodily response. At a level of being pithy, I will say it's not the stress that causes hypercholesterolemia or the heart issues. It's the response to the stress, the body system and the body-mind system's response that leads to the hypercholesterolemia and the heart problems. And so it's not only correct philosophically, it's not only correct psychologically, but it's correct in terms of biomedical science to say assertively that while X number of people may go through similar or identical stress, it's the way different people respond that determines the health effect. So I'll repeat myself. That's true philosophically as a good trait, not to get too rattled. It's good psychologically, as we believed till recently. But by now we know biomedically that what happens with repetitive cumulative stress is the LDL and the HDL both getting affected, especially the LDL going very high.
But Dr. Desai, you said cumulative stress and the bodily response to stress. Now, is the response to stress under our control? Say, if we are in a stressful situation, it is a natural body function to go into fight or flight. It is the natural body response. So, when it is so natural, why is it going wrong?
That amount of acute immediate response is unavoidable and natural. Might vary only somewhat, but is unavoidable, natural. I quite agree with you. The thing to realize is that soon after, in a few minutes or a few hours, both in terms of thought and emotions and the behavioral response, how we deal with it is what will matter. And the best example of that, without being unfair to the others concerned, is if you are a cricket aficionado, Dhoni. Dhoni's response as a skipper in the most adverse situations was implacable, right? That's the kind, only as an example, that's the kind of response not all of us may be able to achieve. I don't claim I am able to achieve, but towards that kind of response, to repeat myself, in terms of thought, in terms of emotions, and in terms of behavioral response. Because to explain what I said earlier, it is my response to the stress in a few hours or in a few days following it and over time, cumulatively, that determines what health effect it will have. What you mentioned are the immediate hormones which are released of adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline helps in that flight or fight response. But cortisol level over time when sustained determines the LDL levels. And that definitely is to some extent again genetically determined. We are all differently placed. I mean, you can't expect Kapil Dev and Sunil Gavaskar to have the same temperament, right? You don't
Right.
expect Virat Kohli and Dhoni to have the same temperament. They're different people. But each one of them can train oneself so that the health effects, negative health effects are minimal.
And Dr. Desai, there's a reason why MS Dhoni is
Sure.
called Captain Cool, because his predisposition is such that he doesn't get too flustered. But Dr. Desai, you said that you can train yourself to not respond to stress over the long term, so that you're not, accumulating a lot of cortisol in your body over time. Now, I want to discuss, how the training happens. But before that, I want to understand: is there actual evidence to show that higher cortisol levels in our body have started accumulating because we're taking a lot of stress? Small things start stressing us, and we keep accumulating this stress. Does this lead to high levels of cortisol in the body? And does the high level of cortisol equate with a lipid problem?
Yes, for the first question, the answer is yes. And your second implied question, high level of continued cortisol response leading to higher levels of LDL. And so the LDL HDL ratio getting mixed up. There's good enough evidence for that. The thing to realize is this is the one direct effect. If I might just mention what we might discuss later, of course, the indirect mediated effects of stress and its response are also through food habits and the nature of food that we eat. But we'll come to that possibly a bit later. Surely training, Anisha, is possible. Training oneself is possible, not in terms of responding or not responding. If I might take you up a little on that, responding meaningfully. Doing what I need to do to take care of the threat or the performance that is expected of me. That's a meaningful response. Fretting and fuming about it without appropriate behavioral response is what is unhealthy and undesirable. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, Dr. Desai, but we live today in a world which is akin to living in a pressure cooker. There is a lot of pressure on every side. And even though I know that this should not be my response, I should be a little more calm. And the same situation will repeat itself day after day after day. I'm still having the same reaction day after day after day. So how do you change your mental setup?
I'm laughing, not even smiling, because you couldn't have known this. I have said this in various forms of media, but I grant that you wouldn't have known this. Honestly, at the most simplistic level, my model of mind for public awareness and education is the pressure cooker model, as you mentioned. See, that steam collecting in that pressure cooker has two mechanisms. One is the regular release of steam through the steam valve, and second is the whistle blowing. So when there is a danger, the whistle blows. And so whatever I am doing in the study, I rush and say, let me switch it off. Okay? So both those are important. The regular outlet being available, a mechanism for regular outlet, sharing or expression, and of course, recognizing when there is a threat or a danger. So like you are mentioning, if you or I or any one of us finds oneself or others around us observe that ever so often or more than commonly the behavioral and the emotional response is out of control, I would see that as a red signal and say, do I need to go modify my thinking and emotional style as well as my response? And of course, needless to say, there need be no shame or hesitation in that. But I absolutely love and adore the pressure cooker example because, to repeat myself, the regular outlet for steam and the protective mechanism of the whistle blowing. If you didn't have that, every pressure cooker every day in every kitchen would burst. Like we all.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true, Dr. Desai. But you are raising issues of mental health here. How one deals with stress is also good mental health. Now, are you saying mental health is in any case not discussed very openly in our country.
Mhm.
Secondly, are you saying that poor mental health can lead to physical problems, notably heart problems?
Absolutely. And I would talk about two levels of mental health, as I think you and I have at some platforms discussed. One is the diagnosable psychiatric disorders like depression, anxiety,
Mm.
whatever else. The lower substrate level is more important, not the psychiatric disorder, but the
Mm.
psychological distress or the psychological ill health. So, it's the psychological ill health that's much more associated with the heart problems or any other cardiovascular issues, in fact. Needless to say that people with diabetes, people with cardiac problems, they all have a poorer prognosis. They also have associated depression, diagnosable. But that's the higher level issue. Even if you don't have that, the softer psychological ill health, and that you and I have been talking about in the last few minutes, says any one of us, so-called normals, not in any psychiatric disorder, not having an appropriate stress response. What might be also useful here, Anisha, to briefly recap for our listeners and friends is obviously there are three or four components to the stress response. To some extent, we are all genetically endowed, less or more, to see how we respond. But the second part is, like we said, how do we train ourselves? And third, of course, if you pause and think, a lot of people unfortunately learn it the hard way when you have a stroke or a cardiac compromise, heart attack. After the first or second episode, then you perforce train yourself not to respond by fretting and fury. Right? Most
Okay.
people do that if you reflect. I wish more of us would learn to do that before that happens.
Okay. From others' examples.
Yes.
Okay. So you said one is a genetic predisposition that could be responsible.
The second
One
is
is
how you are
conditioning.
trained. Yes.
Your conditioning.
Absolutely.
And the third is learning the lesson the hard way and doing it after going through a lot of trauma.
I'm
Now-
saying not learning the hard way, learning from
Not
science.
All right.
Yeah.
So Dr. Desai, all the cardiologists told us that our lifestyle is important for our health, especially our heart health. And they recommend good diet, which is very important, where we need to have lesser trans fat, lesser oil. They also emphasized on exercise. Now, exercise, when you do a moderate amount of exercise, you have a body response to dopamine and you feel happy.
Sure.
Does not that reduce the accumulation of cortisol that is happening
would.
because the small stresses?
It would. Dopamine in the brain level, prostaglandins in the body system, both. So dopamine at the cerebral level, prostaglandins in the general body system would definitely counter those negative effects of a hyper response if there is, for sure. But before we miss, let me also bring in what I mentioned earlier. There's a lot of indirect effect of stress and stress response related to cardiac risk through food. One is the amount of food. The amount of food in anxiety and stress in many people is directly correlated. And so your food intake kind of only leads to more and more of cholesterol and specifically LDL, unhealthy foods. More is also the comfort food. We all know, again, by experience and from science, that high carbohydrate, high starch foods are very comforting. And in terms of stress, meeting with stress, it's very comforting at that point of time. Now, so if I cannot psychologically develop myself strong enough to respond meaningfully, then I take recourse to comfort foods.
Yes, a tub of ice cream is always a good friend.
Yes.
When there is no friend to talk to, then a tub of ice cream always helps, right? So you're saying this is the correlation between stress, bad eating.
Very much. So all of them, really. The direct effect, to summarize, the direct effect, as we discussed in some detail. The second is lack of physical exercise. And the three, food habits in a number of ways during stressful period or repetitive stress period. So all this together, and of course, not to deny at all, that there would always be, there is a genetic basis for also hypercholesterolemia. So there are people who are genetically lucky to not have the propensity to hypercholesterolemia.
Mhm.
You know?
Right. Okay. So, genetics aside, let's talk about things that we can control and can
Hmm?
change.
Hmm?
Now, Dr. Desai, how do you break this cycle of getting stressed, eating wrongly, getting your cholesterol higher? Because, this seeming like a virtuous cycle, very difficult to get out of once you're in it. Where should you take the first step? Is it what you
Allow me.
eat? Is it your stress? What should you do first?
Food, of course, and you and I both seem to be smiling, enjoying that reference to food as comfort food. But I'm sure a lot of our friends recognize that to varying degrees we are all susceptible to it. But to again, if you allow me to be pithy, uh, if somebody moves from Pune or Chennai or Bangalore or Bombay to Delhi or any of these cities up north, and then if one is not prepared for the extreme summer and more importantly the extreme winter, that won't work, right? So if I know that I have to live in Delhi or Jaipur or Lucknow through a winter or through many winters, then I better be prepared for it. Forewarned is forearmed. So in case one can anticipate stresses and be prepared for it cognitively or with whatever means logistics we need to do, sure. Two, what happens during stress, as you mentioned, flight and flight response, other than that, is the catastrophization. That you imagine the worst case scenario and your body and emotional system begin to respond. So that's the cognitive error that we need to minimize or avoid. Three, always helps to evaluate as objectively as one can what is the immediate result, what the immediate worst case scenario, what the long term bad case or worst case scenario. Uh, to use a very old adage, pain is universal, suffering is optional. Similarly, in today's world, stress is unavoidable. How you respond to it is reasonably within one's control. And the control is, as we said, to repeat, be prepared for it. Uh, don't let catastrophization or maximization happen. See that you can have a realistic plan. Four, always a good idea to bounce the experience of somebody. Sharing, expressing, ventilation, getting better ideas. And in the context of what we're discussing today, particularly, if my life situation, or God forbid your life situation, is of a nature where repetitive stress is unavoidable, then I need to be better prepared for it. What's also good, Anisha, if I might mention, is that there is this concept of resilience, uh, socio-culturally and psychobiologically. And so while I'll agree with our cardiologist's concerns about how it's been known for a few decades that South Asians here and South Asian immigrants on the continent or in the US have a higher rate of CHD, there is also the benefit of resilience that we have. Individual, family and social support, and the cultural mechanisms. What we need to do, if at all, one is going through a lot of stress, is tap on those resources. Can I tap on my internal resilience? Can I tap on the family and social support system? Can I invoke my cultural mechanisms, including religion and spiritual practices? And I'm not talking about theism here. I'm not talking about being religious or a-religious. I'm primarily talking about the spiritual values, that and a whole lot of cultural values. And so there's certainly a lot to be said for long-term preparedness for dealing with stress if it is repetitive and unavoidable. And before I forget, uh, there's something else that's known. I suspect that might not have come up. Some 50 or 60 odd years ago in the 60s and 70s, research came up very, very strong of what is called type A behavior pattern, predominantly Western 20th century post World War scenario, but now we are becoming very much so in India too. Type A behavior pattern, very briefly, was described to be this ambitious, constantly working, hard driving, not compromising, rigid, result oriented person. You know, And the evidence has been very good since the 60s and 70s. The type A behavior pattern is related to CHD. What's more interesting is that for people who have been through one CHD incident, individual therapy or group therapy can actually modify type A behavior pattern and, more importantly, thereby reduce the risk of second or the third heart attack. So that evidence is also, in fact, very good. Modifying oneself.
Right. So, Dr. Desai, you've given us good workable tips. One is to anticipate what could go wrong, and then determine how you will already decide and determine how you will react, not over dramatize or see it as catastrophic, and develop these habits. Now, people also feel that earlier we used to have friends, we used to hang out with friends, and just by being with friends, being with family, we would feel relaxed, and stress, even if we had some stressful events, would reduce. Now, what is happening is we are just connected digitally. And even though we're connected, the connection is not the same. Plus, which side of the fence do you stand on? Do you feel that passive watching of comedy shows is a good stress buster? What do you think can be, okay, one thing is to prepare myself, okay, I'm going to have this problem and this is the way I can react. One thing is, let me just watch a comedy show. My friends now, they never mind. I'll just, relax and feel better. Does it work?
Of course. I'm not even smiling, laughing, because I hope you won't misunderstand that when I differ with you, or I'm not even differing, I'm just modifying that to a more meaningful, constructive outlook, right? And that is that a few decades ago, television was the evil guy.
Now, isn't it still the evil guy?
Now it is no. It has been replaced by social media, the mobile phone, right? Now, my point is that throughout history, from the time of invention of fire to atomic energy, to television, to social media, all these new inventions and technologies are always double-edged swords. It depends on how individuals or groups or families or societies apply and use it. There is certainly a lot of dark side to it. And so those who are vulnerable or those who are getting into it, they need to be watchful, or others need to be watchful. But for that, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Television, social media can not only be a huge communication channel like we are able to do now. We are able to have this session only because of that technology, right? I mean, imagine for a minute if the epidemic had happened before the social media. How would emotional support have been, right?
It would have been very, very tough.
Exactly. So there are always pluses and minuses. It depends on how we use it. And of course, assessing for oneself or for people around how vulnerable is one to it. So, put it differently, to answer your question more directly, in the 20s and 30s in US or on European continent, in India, even in the 60s and 70s, most social support and emotional support came through in-person interaction, as you said. Then it changed to telephone and television and human presence in the home. Now it has come to social media and virtual technology like we are doing now. Okay. So if we can have, as a human race, and unduly, appropriately be using it for all those purposes of even meeting with stress. I really do think that the idea of couch potato has been exaggerated. And the whole thing about social media being the evil guy is really exaggerated. If we can just take a middle of the road position there.
Okay. So, Dr. Desai, you've given us workable strategies. Now, for an average person, say somebody who's ambitious, who's going up the corporate ladder, working hard, and taking on a reasonable amount of stress, targets to meet, employees to keep happy, customers to keep happy. For a person like this, how should he build his everyday life, say one day, so that he may make some differences, some things he can do to reduce the amount of cortisol he's going to accumulate because of the stresses that will come in the day? Should he start his day with exercise, do yoga, do meditation? end the evening with a comedy show. What do you think should be the way people should live their lives?
Two things occur to me, and I might enlarge that elaborate if time and you permit. But two things occur to me. One is to have buffer systems, internal and external, both. So again, people will differ in terms of how their internal buffer systems are. How much do I need to ventilate? How much do I need to express? How much do I need to, fret and fume? If I need to, that's fine. Do I have, when I say external buffer system, some of it you mentioned, religion and spiritual activities to music to what have you, right? That's one point that I want to make. Build buffer systems, identify your buffer protective mechanisms, and if you don't have enough, strengthen them. Second is more of a proscription or at least caution. Tobacco, alcohol, caffeine. Again, no extreme positions there. Please be sure, all of us. But tobacco, alcohol, at least some people recognize. Caffeine, we don't even often recognize. Is a huge problem when if you are having a anxiety trait or if you have a stressful life. Because to relieve the anxiety, you keep having tobacco or caffeine, if not alcohol also, it over time only blunts your response to the stress being managed. And so, to repeat myself, one, internal and external buffer systems as practical as they can be, as you said. And two, be very careful about not falling into the traps of alcohol, tobacco, or caffeine unduly.
Mm-hmm. All right. And build in exercise, good diet.
Oh, absolutely. Sure. Like we said earlier, that possibly the best thing one can do. Appropriate, age appropriate, and whatever is one's physical capacity.
All right. Yeah. Dr. Desai, people see stress as a mental thing. As we close this show, could you please reiterate for the audience the physical impact that stress can have in one's life and the importance of reducing the amount of stress we accumulate every day?
Sure. Stress in itself is inevitable, unavoidable. I think it has always been so. Even for the cavemen, whatever they went through was stressful, I dare say. Okay. I mean, we want to highlight this fact that, stress is very high now. I think it's always been so. Obviously, it's a bit high now. But like you and I both said, and repeatedly, it's not the stress that causes the physical health issues, primarily, notably the heart disease and cholesterol problems. It's our body-mind systems response that increases the risk. And that is what we first need to realize. Two, as you had asked, can that be modified and can one train oneself? Yes, one can to a significant extent train oneself. What if one does not do so? One is left with an unpleasant taste in one's own mouth. People around feel more stress, and so you induce stress in others and in others' health development of health problems. Three, most importantly, your body system also gets into a rhythm. Your body-mind system gets into a rhythm depending on how I've handled it on, say, X1, X2, X3. So X4 and X5, I'm going to do the same. So unless I check myself and break that pattern, the cumulative effect is going to be there. Most importantly, again, at all levels, philosophically, psychologically, and in terms of body-mind biomedicine, is the flexibility of the system that provides more protection than rigidity. So any rigid pattern of behavior, psychologically or physically, will only lead to more harm. What we need to do is, as you and I both said in between, learn from experience, learn from others, learn from science, keep adapting to be flexible, and especially as age advances. Can I also say toward the end that a whole lot of these things that we have discussed and many that we have not had time to discuss, NCD prevention or prevention of heart problems or cholesterolemia is difficult to achieve if you suddenly realize and start doing something at 52 or 55 or 60. It has to happen when you are 25 or 30 or 32. So we need to really get this message across more to youngsters and, as you said, young and adult executives, not only to people who are 50 or 55, 60. That's a bit late, never too late, and yet a bit late.
All right. So we need to start early, and we can train ourselves to respond better to stress, which will improve our heart conditions, our health, and our well-being. Thank you so much, Dr. Desai, for joining us today.
Pleasure.
And piecing together this whole connection between stress and lipids, which affects our
If
health.
I mention one more time, pressure cooker model.
Yes, the pressure cooker. The pressure cooker has its own system to release, to vent out the stress that it feels. Everybody should figure out a way for themselves as well, because it's ultimately going to affect our health in the long term. Thank you so much, Dr. Desai, for joining us.
Pleasure, always. Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining us and sharing with the audience the insights that you have and the wealth of your experience. So we're going to wrap up the show here. Do keep in mind that stress is not going to help you, and it's not going to help your cholesterol. So try to keep it in check, not when it's too late. Start early, building a good lifestyle, which is both diet, exercise, and your mental makeup. We'll wrap it up here. Stay tuned to our Facebook page for all the updates on the new shows that we do and the nuggets of information we bring you on health and well-being. This program was supported by Lupin. I'm going to sign off here. Take care. Goodbye.